Welcome to this quiet sleep history video, where the pace stays slow and simple, and the details are ordinary, so you can listen without effort and let your mind drift when it wants to. And tonight's topic is a calm sleep journey of observing the unhurried growth of lichen on ancient stones, starting at a plain outdoor site with old rock that has been sitting for many years. Maybe a low stone wall or a few scattered blocks with rough surfaces, small cracks, and edges softened by weather. And on those surfaces are thin patches of lichen in muted colors like gray, pale green, and dull yellow. And lichen is a living partnership, usually a fungus with algae or cyanobacteria that can live directly on stone without roots, following a steady routine of moisture and dryness, becoming active when rain, dew, fog, or humid air wets the surface, then going still again as the stone dries. And in this story, you simply return to the same stones again and again, noticing where shade lasts longer, where water runs down after rain, where dust collects in a crack, and how the lichen quietly holds its place and slowly spreads along the rock's texture in a repeating, ordinary process. You come back to the same ancient stones on another quiet day and stand in the same spot, choosing one familiar block to look at again, and you notice the lichen in simple shapes that stay close to the rock, some patches like thin crust, and some with small, soft edges. And you pay attention to ordinary causes like shade, sun, and moisture, because lichen takes in water from dew, rain, fog, and humid air, then goes still again when the surface dries. And today most of the stone looks dry and pale, but a narrow crack feels a little cooler, and the lichen along that crack looks slightly darker and more continuous, as if that protected line holds dampness longer. And you also see how lichen often gathers in tiny pits and rough grains where dust collects and water can cling as a thin film. And you imagine this repeating pattern continuing through many days, wetting and drying, swelling a little when damp, flattening when dry, while the stone stays in place and the lichen slowly holds on and spreads in small, quiet steps. On a later visit, you arrive after a light rain, not enough to puddle, just enough to leave the stones evenly damp, and you notice first how the rock looks darker overall, with a soft shine in some places and a dull matte look in others. And you move close to the familiar block and see that the lichen patches look a little fuller and more defined when wet, with edges that stand out slightly from the stone. And you keep your attention on routine details, like how water sits differently on different textures, beading on smoother spots and soaking into rougher grains. And you watch a thin line of water slowly follow a shallow groove, passing through lichen and bare rock in the same steady way. And you think about how lichen handles this common pattern, taking in moisture through its surface, then using light later when the clouds thin or the day brightens. And for now, the air feels cool and the dampness stays, especially in corners where the wind does not reach. And you notice that the lichen is more common on the side of the stone that faces away from the strongest sun, where drying is slower and the wet time lasts longer. And you see small specks of grit stuck on the lichen in a few places, likely left by splashes, and you imagine those tiny particles drying in place later, becoming part of the surface layer. And as you stand there, you do not look for a big change, only the usual cycle: stone becoming wet, lichen becoming active, then everything gradually drying again, with the same gentle repetition that continues each time the weather shifts. On another day, you return in the early morning, before the sun has warmed the stones, and you notice a thin, uneven layer of dew resting on the rock in small patches rather than everywhere at once. And the dew sits longest in shaded spots and in shallow dips where cool air lingers. And you look again at the same stone face, seeing how the lichen responds to this simple moisture, appearing slightly darker where the dew has formed and lighter where the surface is already drying. And you follow the stone's small features, a hairline crack, a rough ridge, a shallow pit, and you notice that lichen often makes use of these tiny structures because they hold a little water longer and protect the surface from quick drying wind. And you imagine the lichen doing its regular work in these short, damp hours, taking in water directly through its body and using whatever light is available, then slowing down again as the morning progresses and the dew fades. And you pay attention to the ordinary signs of time passing, the way the dew line pulls back from a sunny edge first, the way the stone warms unevenly, and the way a lichen patch can look slightly more raised at the start of the morning and flatter later. And you think about how this routine repeats across many mornings in a year, with some seasons bringing longer damp periods and other seasons bringing quicker drying. And through all of it, the lichen stays in place, adjusting quietly to the same daily pattern without moving. And you keep the habit of returning, observing the same small areas as they cycle through moisture and dryness again.
You visit again on a dry day, when the air feels less humid and the stone surfaces look lighter and more powdery, and you notice how the lichen blends into the rock when it is dry, with crusty patches lying flat and the edges less noticeable. And you choose a small section of the familiar stone, no larger than your hand, and you study it like a simple map, tracing where one lichen patch ends and bare rock begins, and seeing how the patch follows tiny pits and grains, as if it is using the roughness for support. And you notice a few places where the lichen forms a thin line along a crack, and you think about how that crack can collect fine dust and tiny bits of plant matter, and how rain can carry dissolved minerals across the surface and leave them behind. And you imagine these small deposits building slowly over time, not in a dramatic way, just by repeated contact with air and water. And you consider how lichen grows by adding small amounts at its edges, with the center often staying older and more stable. And when the surface is dry, the activity is minimal, but the structure remains ready for the next damp period. And you notice ordinary marks in the stone, too. Faint scratches, small chips, and slightly different colors where the rock has weathered unevenly. And you watch how the lichen pattern fits around those marks, staying close to the stone, keeping its place, and waiting through the dry hours for the next routine change in moisture.
You return during a time of year when fallen leaves and small bits of plant matter are more common on the ground, and you notice how some of that material ends up near the stones, caught in gaps between blocks or tucked against the base where wind and rain push it. And you look at the lower edges of the wall or the bottom side of a single stone and see that the surface there often stays slightly more shaded and slightly more damp, and the lichen in these areas can look more continuous, not because it is moving quickly, but because the conditions are a little steadier. And you observe the simple process of how organic material breaks down slowly, turning into fine particles that mix with dust, and how that mix can collect in small cracks and shallow pits on the stone, making a thin, gritty layer that holds moisture a little longer after rain. And you notice a few tiny green films or faint stains near these sheltered spots that look different from the thicker lichen patches. And you keep your attention on what is ordinary and repeating, like how rainwater can wash a narrow path down the stone and leave a slightly cleaner line, while nearby areas keep more dust, and how the lichen tends to keep its foothold where the surface is rough and the dampness lasts. And you imagine the same basic routine continuing through many weather cycles, with plant bits gathering, breaking down, and washing away, and with lichen remaining close to the rock, taking in moisture when it arrives, using light when it can, and staying still when the surface dries. You come back on a day with a light breeze, and you notice how the moving air changes small things without changing the scene, drying some stone faces faster than others and carrying fine dust that settles in quiet corners. and you stand close to the same familiar block and pay attention to the direction the wind seems to come from, because the windward side feels a little drier and the sheltered side feels slightly cooler. And you notice that lichen patches on the sheltered side often look more even, not brighter or more dramatic, just more steady in their outline. And you watch how the breeze nudges a loose leaf against the stone and then lets it fall away. And you think about how this kind of contact happens many times, leaves and small twigs brushing the surface, dropping tiny particles, then moving on. And you look at a shallow groove where dust is collected and see that the lichen follows that groove in a thin band, using the rough channel as a place where moisture can linger after a light rain. And you keep your attention on the slow, repeated process that is always in the background. Lichen taking in water when it is available, pausing when it is dry, and holding on to the same small area of rock, while wind continues its quiet work of drying, carrying dust, and shaping which parts of the stone stay damp for a little longer. You return at midday when the sun is higher and the shadows are shorter, and you notice how the top faces of the stones feel warmer while the sides stay cooler, and you choose the same stone again, looking at it from above first and then from the side, because the angle of light changes what you can see. And in the brighter light, the dry lichen looks flatter and more blended with the rock, with pale, crusty areas that follow the stone's rough grain. And you notice that some patches form small round shapes with slightly clearer edges, while others spread in thin, irregular lines. And you focus on simple causes, like how water runs off the top faster, while a side face may stay damp longer after a morning dew, and how a shallow pit can hold a tiny bit of moisture even when nearby rock is already dry. And you imagine the lichen using these small differences in a steady routine, becoming more active when moisture is present, then settling back into stillness as the warmth dries the surface. And you watch for ordinary signs of this change, like the way a patch looks a little darker where the stone stays cooler and a little lighter where it has warmed. And you notice faint mineral streaks on the rock that show where water has flowed many times. And you see lichen growing alongside those paths, not quickly, just staying near the places where moisture tends to pass again and again. And you keep the scene simple: stone warming and cooling, moisture arriving and leaving, and lichen remaining in place, following the same slow pattern through another normal part of the day. You return in the late afternoon when the light is softer again and the stones begin to cool, and you notice how the surface that felt warm at midday now feels more neutral, and you look at the same lichen patches with the same quiet routine, checking the crusty areas on the flat top, then the thin bands along a crack, then the speckled spots on the side face, and you pay attention to small changes that come from temperature and air moisture, because as the day cools, the air can hold moisture differently, and a stone that was dry for hours can begin to feel slightly cooler to the touch, especially in shaded areas. And you watch how the lichen looks a little more distinct in some places as the light shifts, not because it has grown in minutes, but because the angle makes edges easier to see. And you think about how many times this daily pattern repeats over a year, with long, dry afternoons, then cooler evenings, then nights when dew may form again. And you notice a thin line of darker stone near the base where moisture tends to linger. And nearby, the lichen pattern is more continuous, as if it has more regular chances to take in water. And you imagine the lichen's simple work continuing through the evening, ready to absorb dampness if it arrives, and ready to pause again if the surface stays dry. And you keep returning to the same small areas, letting the observations stay steady and ordinary, like checking the same quiet clock that measures time in slow, repeating cycles. You return after a night when the air stayed humid, and in the morning the stones feel cool and slightly damp, even where there's no visible dew. And you notice that the lichen looks a little darker overall, with its edges easier to pick out against the rock. And you take your time with one small section of the familiar stone, moving your attention slowly from left to right, noticing how a crust patch covers the high points of the grain, while a thinner film sits in the low points. And you see how the lichen follows tiny cracks like narrow roads, because cracks hold moisture a little longer and also catch fine dust that the wind leaves behind. And you think about how each humid night is like a small, regular refill, not a dramatic event, just another chance for the lichen to take in water through its surface and do its basic living work for a while. And you imagine the quiet chemical and physical processes that happen when wet, small exchanges with the air, small use of light as the sky brightens, and then, later, as the day warms, the stone will dry again and the lichen will become still. And you notice a faint line where water has often run down the stone face, leaving a slightly cleaner path. And beside it, the lichen is a bit more broken up, as if repeated flow sometimes washes the surface too clean. While on a nearby rough patch where water moves more slowly, the lichen looks more steady. And you keep the scene simple and routine. Humid air cooling at night, stone holding that coolness into morning, lichen taking advantage of the damp period, and the same slow cycle preparing to repeat again. You come back again with the same steady habit, and you bring your attention to a different stone nearby, one that has a slightly different texture, with a smoother face on one side and a more gritty face on the other. And you notice that the lichen patterns change with that texture, spreading more easily across the gritty areas and appearing thinner or more broken on the smoother areas. And you take your time looking at the boundary where these two textures meet, because small boundaries often show the routine rules of growth more clearly. And you see that in the rougher zone, the lichen forms a wider patch with many tiny points of contact, while in the smoother zone, it follows fine scratches and shallow dents as if it is choosing the few places where water can cling. And you think about how rainwater and dew do not behave the same on every surface, and how a slightly smoother face may shed moisture faster, while a rough face can hold a thin film longer. And you notice a small chip on the edge of the stone where a fresh-looking surface is exposed, lighter in color than the rest. And on that new spot there is little or no lichen yet, just bare rock. And you imagine how over time dust will settle there, moisture will wet it again and again, and lichen may slowly begin at the edge, adding small amounts along the border. And you keep the focus on the ordinary repetition, stones warming and cooling, getting wet and drying, collecting dust, losing dust, and lichen responding in small, slow steps that are easy to observe only when you return often and look in the same careful, quiet way. You return on a day when the sky is overcast and the light stays even, and the stones do not heat up as quickly, so the surfaces hold on to dampness a little longer. And you stand near the familiar wall and look at several stones in a row, noticing how each one has a slightly different pattern of lichen, depending on its angle, its roughness, and how much water reaches it. And you pay attention to small, repeated signs, like where water tends to collect at the lower edges, where thin runoff lines form after rain, and where tiny, sheltered pockets stay cool. And you notice that on some stones, the lichen forms overlapping patches that meet like quiet borders, with one pale crust pushing up to the edge of another. And you imagine that this happens through very slow edge growth, a little at a time, during many wet periods. And you also see places where the stone face looks cleaner and more open, possibly where water flows more often, or where the surface flakes slightly. And there the lichen is thinner or broken into smaller islands. And you keep your attention on the routine of being there, standing still, scanning the same surfaces, letting your eyes follow a crack from top to bottom, then moving to a neighboring pit, then to a faint mineral stain. And you think about how the lichen's daily life is made from these simple conditions, taking in moisture directly through its body, using light when it can, and waiting calmly through dry stretches, while the stones remain in place and the weather repeats its quiet cycles. You return to the stones one more time, in a quiet, ordinary way, not in a rush and not expecting anything special, and you take the same path you have taken before, stepping carefully on the uneven ground, noticing small familiar things like dry grass near the edges, a few scattered leaves in low spots, and the way the air feels slightly different depending on whether you are in sun or shade. And when you reach the old stones, you do what you have been doing all along, which is simply to look, slowly and patiently, at the same surfaces, the same rough faces, and the same small patches of lichen that stay close to the rock. And you choose the familiar stone again, and you let your eyes move across it in a steady routine, from the top edge down to the side face, then along the cracks, then across the shallow pits where dust settles. And you notice how the lichen sits in quiet shapes, some areas thin and crusty, some edges slightly softer, and you remember the simple facts that keep repeating here, that lichen is a partnership, living as one body, usually a fungus with algae or cyanobacteria, that it does not have roots, and that it depends on the everyday arrival and leaving of moisture, taking in water from dew, fog, rain, and humid air, then becoming still when the surface dries. And you stay with the plain details of how the stone itself guides all of this, because the stone has microplaces that behave differently, a sunny corner that dries fast, a shaded side that stays cool longer, a crack that holds dampness, a rough patch that keeps a thin film of water. And you look at those microplaces the way you might look at a familiar room, noticing where things always tend to be and where small changes happen without fuss. And today, you pay attention to the faint mineral lines that show where water has run many times, leaving a slightly cleaner path. And you notice how lichen can be more broken up right along a frequent runoff line, while it may be steadier on a nearby rough area where water moves more slowly. And you see tiny grains of grit stuck in some lichen patches, and you think about how those grains arrived through ordinary means, carried by wind, splashed by rain, brushed by leaves, then left behind to dry. And you take a moment to look at the base of the stones, where small bits of plant matter gather. And you notice how those bits break down over time into fine particles, mixing with dust, collecting in gaps, and holding a little moisture longer after damp nights. And you keep it simple, because what happens here is mostly repetition. Water arriving, water leaving, the stone warming and cooling, the air changing from dry to humid and back again, and the lichen responding in the same quiet way each time, active when wet, still when dry. And you imagine the many ordinary days that look almost identical to this one, days when the stone is dry and pale, days when a light rain darkens it, mornings when dew sits in shaded dips, afternoons when wind dries exposed faces, and evenings when cooling air makes the surface feel calm and neutral again. And as you stand there, you allow your attention to narrow to a very small area, maybe just the size of your hand, and you trace the boundary of one crust patch, noticing how the edge follows the grain of the rock, how it curves around a tiny pit, how it thins near a smoother spot. And you think about growth as a quiet edge process, small additions at the margins over many wet periods, not something you can watch in real time, but something that becomes clearer when you return and look again and again. And you also notice a lighter chip on the stone where fresh rock is exposed. And you accept that it is mostly bare now, and you picture how over time dust will settle there, moisture will visit it, and a thin line of lichen may begin along the border, using the roughness and the repeated dampness when it comes. And you keep your body still and relaxed as you look, letting your shoulders drop, letting your jaw rest, letting your breathing stay slow. And you do not try to hold every detail, because the scene does not require that. And gradually, you become aware of the broader setting again, the quiet air around the stones, the steady light, the absence of urgent motion. And you let the stones be what they are, old surfaces with small cracks and pits, holding the marks of weather, holding small living layers that follow moisture and light. And you let yourself stop searching for changes and simply accept the ongoing routine, the same cycle that will continue whether you watch it or not. And as your attention softens, you imagine the stones later, after you have left, as the light shifts, as the air cools, as humidity rises or falls, as a thin film of moisture might return during the night, and the lichen would be ready in its quiet way, taking in water when it is there, pausing when it is gone, staying in place on the ancient rock. And you allow that steady, repeating process to carry on in the background of your mind without effort, while you let your own attention loosen, becoming quieter and more distant, with nothing you need to do now except rest.